Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another amazing Talks at Google event. It doesn't take a very detailed search to see that the news headlines these days are rather troubling on the international front. We're seeing in many cases an assault on the international system, 50 years of peace and prosperity from things like the European Union to NATO. And where do we stand with all that? What is the impact on governments, on corporations? Today we're very thrilled to have Bob Amsterdam with us today to talk about this very issue. Bob is an international lawyer specializing in corporate law and also advising governments. His career has been very storied across a dozen countries from Asia, Africa, Europe, and Latin America. And today he's here to talk about disruption in the international system, arguing that that the political pressure being applied against the judicial systems and prosecutors today have resulted in a crisis of legitimacy that's weakened institutions. So he'll start out by talking a little bit about the current situation and then some thoughts for the future. And with that, thank you very much and welcome to Google.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much. I'm going to be talking today about essentially how corporations can thrive in the upcoming trade wars and issues that have been raised by the rise of populism in the world, not just in the United States with the Trump election, but in Europe with Brexit and now potentially Frexit, in the Philippines with Duterte, in Mexico. We've seen this rising tide of populism. And of course now, 6 weeks after the election, we're seeing a tremendous level of discourse in the United States concerning Russia's impact on American politics. And I thought, given how current that topic is, that we might take a few minutes to discuss it. I've spent most of my life studying Russia and was involved in the Yukos case in Russia in 2003, when the Russian government essentially stole the assets of Yukos and jailed its founder. And I was working with him and one of the defense team for him for many years, and was arrested in Russia in September of 2005. And one of the things that has hit me about the present scenario in the United States that seems to have been missed by many is that the Trump agenda substantively is a mirror of the Putin agenda. And not only does it go against Americans' policy of open-door capitalism, but it goes against what this country has defined as its national interests, particularly the embrace of Nigel Farage, the embrace of those who want to see the EU split. This is from page 1 of Vladimir Putin's game book. This is what he was trying to do with his energy diplomacy. This is what he's been trying to do with the invasion of Ukraine and the seizure of Crimea. And in my view, the attack on the American electoral system that took place was never meant to be an attack that would actually place Donald Trump in power. It was meant to be an attack that would undermine not only Hillary Clinton, but the political institutions of the United States. And to that extent, it's been a tremendous success. We are seeing the United States and the Democrats using this series of incidents in particular to move very aggressively. Today, demanding the resignation of Sessions, over the last number of weeks, working very hard in a manner reminiscent of the Tea Party to, if you will, delegitimize the Trump administration at its earliest point. But let's talk about some of Trump's policies, because Firstly, his massive army buildup, again, copies exactly what Vladimir Putin has done in Russia. The xenophobic attacks, the immigration attacks, again, are almost identical. The issues with respect to NGOs and the media. In fact, going so far as to call the media the enemy of the people is actually, to use a term really framed by Stalin in the 30s, and harkens back to some of these commonalities. And what is perhaps most disturbing and most delegitimizing is the lying, the inability, the seeming inability to capture reality. But when you have studied Russia for a long time, you understand that the lying cynically can mean something very much more than that. There's a recent book that came out, Black Wind, White Snow, The Rise of Russia's New Nationalism. And there is a quote from that book that is, I think, really important to read in terms of the Putin mindset. Quote, "Putin has correctly surmised that lies unite rather than divide Russia's political class. The greater and more obvious the lie, the more his subjects demonstrate their loyalty by accepting it, and the more they participate in the great sacral mystery of Kremlin power by believing it." Hannah Arendt, in The Origins of Totalitarianism, stated, "One could make people believe the most fantastic statements one day and trust that if the next day they were given irrefutable proof of their falsehood, they would take refuge in cynicism. Instead of deserting the leaders who had lied to them, they would protest that they had known all along that the statement was a lie, and would admire the leaders for their superior tactical cleverness." Make no mistake that this constant absence of the truth from the White House, unless it is corrected, is extraordinarily corrosive, but also a mimic of some of Vladimir Putin's most significant tactics in having truly destroyed most of Russian civil society in the period that dates from 2003 and the seizure of Yukos. The economic nationalism, however, the economic nationalism both of Putin's Russia, which you can understand because Putin's Russia is an economy that is based on the extractive industries. Putin's Russia is an economy where there must be a constant mobilization against the other, whoever that other may be, in order for Mr. Putin to stay in power. People often don't realize that the real central node of Russian foreign policy isn't geopolitics alone. It is mobilizing the domestic elite to pursue a foreign outcome. That was one of the major drives behind the Syrian attack. So these substantive similarities between Trump and Putin need to be assessed with the same rigor and seriousness that we are attempting to piece together what happened in terms of the collusion. For one, I'll say that tracing this issue of collusion, I think, is less significant than focusing on Trump's policies and behavior. I think, frankly, the Democrats are making a strategic error in going too far into this before a lot of hard evidence has been discovered. And I think in political campaigns and political issues, you are constantly dealing with momentum. And there's a tremendous danger in this particular case that if the smoking gun is not found, the Democrats will have taken an early and very dangerous situation and made it so that their future attacks will be less significant, less important. Because remember, up until today, outside of the issue of immigration, most of the attacks have followed about Russia. We haven't spoken about China. We haven't spoken about the environment, the Arctic. We haven't spoken about entitlements and equality. We haven't really focused, because there hasn't been any substantive legislation yet, on issues such as the nuts and bolts of where healthcare is going. But outside of the parameter of Russia and the United States today, one of the things I want to mention, I think is important, is what I call the presumption of regularity. So often when we talk about Russia or when we talk about China, we presume that these countries and governments operate the way our own does. And that's just not the case. When you're working internationally, either corporately or as a lawyer on behalf of a client, one of the most important things you have to do is disaggregate the power centers within the country with which you are engaged. There is no such thing in many ways as Russia, in the sense that if you're trying to intelligently analyze where power is, you need to analyze the people around Vladimir Putin. Where are the real sources of strength and weakness? And in Russia's case, you have to follow the money, because in so many countries, it's the corruption and it's the money rather than it is the political ideology that actually masks or determines what the next steps are in trying to protect your individual corporate or your individual asset. In terms of other countries and other scenarios, what we've been advocating for our clients is what we call a corporate foreign policy. And we've been doing this since we set up that blog in 2011. We've been talking about the need for corporations to understand that in today's world, neutrality does not exist. The image we have of corporations acting in a neutral manner harkens back to an era of very strong sovereignty, harkens back to an era when your nation state would be the one to fight the fights for you with your particular industry or area of interest. That has gone to a significant extent, and it's been taken away by a wide variety of factors. Number one, a lot of international governance, but number two, the downloading of governmental responsibilities to private industry. I don't think we fully assess how important that's been. From private prisons to private armies, the governments, especially since 2008, have been offloading many of their responsibilities. And they've been doing it not only because of the budget issues, but because of the legitimacy issues. Americans need to understand that brand America is badly wounded, and that the war on terror, combined with the economic collapse of 2008, has horribly wounded our legitimacy and our ability to have a bully pulpit in the world with respect to critical issues such as human rights and rule of law. We are not believed in the world when it comes to our role as a pillar of rule of law. We simply are not believed, which is one of the reasons Donald Trump's embrace of Putin has been endorsed by so many Republicans, because there has been this drive for a powerful leader with a real movement away from the respect for the political institutions. And that's tremendously dangerous to individual corporations, especially larger corporations such as Google, such as this one, where in fact governments are looking, other governments are looking for points of retaliation. They are looking for points or places where they can essentially set up a hostage for American foreign policy. And one of the incredible points of interest in the Trump campaign and now in the Trump presidency is that the attacks on Mexico, the attacks on Australia, the renunciation of the TPP, all of these steps seem not to follow from a coordinated game plan. We seem to be pushing a tremendous amount of legitimacy away from the United States, a tremendous amount of what attracted people to brand America, not just with respect to the politics of these demands, but with respect to the lack of follow-through, the lack of consideration, the lack of competence. It is a very worrying sign that the president, who is well armed with serious experts on China, that his first move with respect to China was to court Taiwan, and then within a matter of a few weeks, to get on the phone with the leader of China, with the quid pro quo for that phone call essentially being a recognition of the one China policy. It is equally concerning that in welcoming Bibi Netanyahu to the United States, he was so willing to talk about a one-nation solution, and yet a few days later reassert the necessity of a two-state solution. These are not minor issues that can be bandied about by a president. These are the most substantive core issues around which American lives have been lost and billions upon billions of dollars have been spent. One of the things that one looks at when one looks at the present scenario, however, is the fact that with this present situation in terms of trading blocs and in terms of Trump's new philosophy and new methodology of dealing with the world, that those corporates who adopt some form of policy, who allow themselves to some extent to be disaggregated away from certain of the government's policies, may well have opportunities. But it is a tremendous necessity now to move for corporations to start adopting policies and start accepting within their own organization the fact that compliance, which has been massively extended by American corporations internationally trying to deal with laws such as the FCPA, compliance has to morph into policy. Because one of the other problems that the United States has faced in this loss of legitimacy has often been the willingness inside the United States to target political prosecutions. Prosecutions such as many under the FCPA. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is an act which is very long on policy, very short on case law, and involves a tremendous amount of prosecutorial discretion, often exercised against foreign corporates. 9 out of 10 of the largest penalties that have been given have been those that have been given against foreign corporates. And this continuing diminution, where in fact, with respect to the FCPA, prosecutors understand that they can go with what they consider to be a credible case and get corporates to roll over time and time again. That methodology hasn't been lost in other countries. When the United States started to push the FCPA, some of the most corrupt rulers followed suit. Kenya's ruler, Arap Moi, used anti-corruption to go after his political opponents. And in Russia, it was anti-corruption that led to the destruction of Yukos and led to the ongoing level of corporate raiding that we've seen in Russia today that continues to escalate. I think one of the important issues that follow from this delegitimization and this change in attitude is something we've called the dual state. The dual state, which is operative in Russia and operative in many other countries, is a concept which relates to part of the activities of the state appearing to be law-abiding, appearing to be based on rules and regulations and foreseeability, and then part of the conduct of the state being completely ungoverned. It was a concept that was designed to deal with Nazi Germany, where you had this tremendous level of judicial competence sitting above organs such as the SS, who would beat and maim and murder without any issue at all. That dual state, to some extent, exists not only in Russia, but in many countries around the world. The deep state, which is an argument that concerns us here in the United States as well, the deep state relates to those people in the government that are embedded within the government, those people in the government here and abroad that are forever, irrespective of the particular administration, that are forever engaged in managing the safety and security of the administration. And there are many people today who believe that the deep state in the United States is on the attack against Donald Trump. But our point in raising it is to talk about how both the deep state and the dual state are part of what corporations need to include in their toolbox. You simply can't look at dealing with foreign countries in a way as if to give credit to the topical explanations or expositions, or as we suggest often, simply allow international arbitration or some form of international dispute resolution to satisfy the needs of corporations. Those types of dispute mechanisms often last years. And with corporate foreign policy, you can be lobbying, you can be disaggregating, you can be focusing on the real power nodes within a country without that level of delay. And often, to everyone's surprise, you can actually litigate in some of the most difficult countries and come out on top. I think one of the big surprises often is that even with tough cases, if you are able, in a country where you can use and get out the media, if you can use the media and put enough pressure on courts that are ostensibly rule of law courts, you can get a result. In other countries, however, it becomes extremely difficult. We represented a political prisoner in Venezuela, an individual who had unfortunately been dragged by Chavez into a dungeon for over 2 years. And for that individual, we managed to get a UN order from one of these organizations within the UN that can provide opinions. An order was obtained for the release of this individual, which the Venezuelan court, amazingly, after he had been illegally incarcerated for 32 months, allowed that man to be freed, only temporarily and only on bail. Unfortunately, within a few minutes, Chavez went on television, ordered the arrest of the judge. The judge was arrested. She was taken to a prison. She was burnt alive on the day of the ruling. She fortunately did not succumb and is still alive today. The client left the court knowing that he could not survive one more day in Chavez's Venezuela, and very fortunately managed to equip himself with a very small propeller-driven device, travel for 3 hours over the ocean managed to get to Curacao, where we had a jet ready to take him to the United States, where he's now managed to obtain asylum. But these types of cases and these types of hostage situations involve understanding and getting to the point of analysis. And one of the things I always recommend to companies is to understand the criminal law in each country in which you operate. Because if there is anything other governments have learned from us, it has been the misuse of criminal law. Not just from us, but obviously from their own histories. And you often find that without the right criminal lawyer, whatever may be your corporate plans, whatever may be the corporate legitimacy, when individuals are taken hostage, you have nowhere to run. And one of the most important things we urge is that when corporates hire attorneys in many of these countries, from a practical standpoint, they don't look to hire the guy who went to Harvard. They don't look to hire the sister firm of the American firm that has an office in Caracas. They don't necessarily look to hire the people that speak English. Rather, they look to hire the people who can manage and navigate the local government, the local area, enough so that they can translate for you what that reality is. So when one turns to today's situation, what does one see? What opportunities and what problems does one see for the future? I'd say number one, the prospect of not only a trade war, but a fundamental attack on the EU, where the United States is seen not as an ally but as an enemy, is a tremendous risk and burden for American corporates. Be very clear, Brexit and the manner in which it's being handled by the May administration is no different than the Mexican Wall. I think they've been organized by the same contractor. The British currency has been depreciated by over 20% relative to the dollar. And the House of Lords just yesterday defeated the government in imposing certain conditions on how Brexit will take place. We've seen real chaos in the UK for the first time legally, because in fact, David Cameron, when he structured Brexit, was addressing a problem within his own political party. There had been no demand for secession. So what happened was we had a vote that some believe was gerrymandered. Then we have a situation where England had just survived one Scottish referendum. Now it faces another Scottish referendum, potentially. In addition to that, the UK and the rest of Europe have been unable to fashion a response to this first massive change in the political dynamics of Europe in dozens of years, which is Putin's ability to keep hold of Crimea. This is an existential threat to Europe that we in the United States have not grasped, the seriousness with which the Europeans view this. Nor have we grasped the seriousness with which Russia has taken its job of disaggregating the EU. The funding that Russia has given so many of the major contestants in EU battles. Le Pen, backed by Russia. Brexit, Farage, backed by Russia. Bulgaria, backed by Russia. Montenegro, backed by Russia. Schulz in Germany, not sure yet, but the Russians are playing very fast and loose with this issue of false news, the propagandizing that is going on throughout the world with this false news, which is something else that companies in the information industry, and we saw Zuckerberg's manifesto recently, which companies in the information industry are going to have to address. Because with so much on the line in terms of what is being disseminated and the levels to which the Russian government is going in Europe, and the way in which the Chinese government is moving very aggressively to pick up the vacuum of American leadership. This is another tremendous issue we face, far more serious than the Russian threat in the future will be the Chinese threat, both economically, in terms of picking off countries for which the United States does not have the same appetite for engagement. I can't even begin to understand what's happened with Australian-American relations. But firstly, we have this America First ideology, this economic nationalism ideology, which is completely unattractive to the rest of the world. The war on terror, the various wars this government has sponsored over the last 50 years are not compelling aspects of brand America. Countries are not attracted to other countries who are constantly expressing a message of fear and concern. The government, the president, is continuing to use the words Islamic terror. Terror is not Islamic. We are alienating 1.5 billion citizens of the earth by talking about terror as somehow being only connected to Islam. Timothy McVeigh, to the best of my understanding, was not practicing Islam at the time that bomb went off. And we can go on and on. These terror attacks, as dangerous and unsettling as they are, have nothing to do with a religion. They have to do with the attempt to seize power and to instrumentalize our media. So our point is that in the future, over these next 4 or, heaven help us, 8 years, we have to hope that this government establishes a real deep understanding of the fact that issues like the maintenance of the EU, issues like a strong power base with Russia, that these issues are internalized. And that yesterday there was an important appointment. Fiona Hill may join the administration with respect to Russia. These kinds of appointments, as well as his appointments with respect to national security and defense, are all to be welcomed. But the issue that truly grabs at us is America is not in a position where we want to adopt economic nationalism, where we want to go to war with our neighbors and our friends. If you had told me any American president would have been able to alienate Mexico and Australia as opposed to what are the natural competitors of the United States, I wouldn't have believed that was possible. Nor would I have believed that in the case of what happened recently with the executive order regarding immigration, that Uber would have immediately lost 200,000 subscribers because they didn't adjust quickly enough to the political issue that they didn't want to be seen supporting the executive order. It is this kind of lightning-like approach to policy as opposed to law that corporations need to embrace very aggressively as we move through these very uncertain waters. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.
You've spent some time in Turkey as well, if I remember. I was wondering what your thoughts are on the current situation there and how it interplays with Russia, for example.
Well, I've been hired by the Turkish government to deal with the situation of Mr. Gulen, who is an imam living in Saylorsburg, Pennsylvania, who runs 170 charter schools in the United States. Those charter schools take $500 million out of the U.S. economy. A percentage of that money is then taken into what it turns out to be essentially as a cult, and then shipped to Turkey to continue to work to undercut the Turkish government. Turkey views Gulen as an existential threat. We have done a series of investigations, which you can find at guleninvestigations.com, which I think fully demonstrate that the Gulen organization is engaged in a massive H-1B visa fraud, where they bring over individuals, state that they earn $53 or some other $1,000, and then rebate that money, a percentage of that money, 15 or 20%, to the imam. Then, in addition to that, they engage in a massive amount of self-dealing through real estate ventures, through crony capitalism at its worst, where Gulen-related construction companies engage in no-bid or low-bid contracts where the quality has just been fairly shocking. And what we've done is we've tried to work with a whole group of American parents and teachers to bring this to light in really the 26 states in which these schools are located. And we've been, frankly, it's been very difficult because the charter school industry in this country is a religious totem for certain people and many Republicans. And even if you say that we're not trying to argue pro-charter or anti-charter, what we're trying to say is, here's a bad charter that needs to be addressed. Even if that's how limited you approach it, it is very difficult because many people simply don't want to hear it. And this is one of the things I'm finding in America today, is that we've really lost the ability to hear our opponents. We've really lost the ability to engage in real, meaningful dialogue. And, there's a book that just came out called The Death of Expertise by a guy named Tom Nichols. And actually, there's a quote in this book that's just, I think it just sums it up. The death of expertise is not just a rejection of existing knowledge. It is fundamentally a rejection of science and dispassionate rationality, which are the foundations of modern civilization. All citizens today believe themselves to be experts on everything. And it's one of, if you'll excuse me, for all of the good that Google has done, it is one of the unfortunate byproducts of Googling, is that people believe that within a few minutes of Googling any subject, they've mastered it. And certainly one of the problems we've faced is trying to explain at the state level from politicians, many of whom have received significant payments from this organization, that there's a very serious problem in terms of not only what this organization did during the coup, but what this organization has been doing in Turkey for many, many years, and what they appear to be intending to do here in the United States.
Really, what the prognosis is for the future in terms of corporations, dealing, on this governmental level? Is it a matter of banding together to sort of express their interest in like a confederation, or is it better just that they each have their own essentially foreign policy?
Well, I think it's going to be necessary for governments to once again attempt to come together. We're going to see the French vote We're going to see the Brexit negotiations. But I think the Trump administration has to decide on what its message is and who its voice is. I mean, we're in an embarrassing scenario here where the president will say one thing to the American public, and then a completely different message is raised in Munich by the vice president. I mean, you can't really run a foreign policy with that many discordant voices at the highest level. So if what happens is the Trump administration starts to veer towards a more middle-of-the-road, historically consistent American position, you're seeing an American economy that is starting to pick up in a major way. And it may be possible that after some very significant veering, toing and froing, we get back on track. We renegotiate NAFTA. We realize that complete abandonment of the TPP and leaving Asia to China may not be the greatest deal in town. And we come up with some new methodology, some powerful series of bilaterals that would save President Trump's face and at the same time keep us in the game. You know, this is a great country that leads the world in technology and leads the world until recently in many key sectors like environmental technology. So I think there's still a tremendous amount of hope. There isn't a necessity for us to be negative completely, but we also have to suggest to the Democrats that we don't want to have another 4 years of a stalemated Congress. And I think the message has to be given to both political parties that they're going to be held accountable. And as somebody who has been ferociously attacking on the issue of Russia, I can say that the level of instrumentalization of this issue of the Russia hack really the Democrats really have to slow down. Or, forget the presumption of innocence. You do have to understand that logically, if you're sitting here looking at what happened in the election, I'm sorry, from my perspective, and I was here for most of the time, if I was going to point to anything that might have swung the election, it was the Democrats forgetting their base, and it was Comey and the FBI. And I think a lot of questions have to be asked of Comey. If he was aware of this Russia stuff, it sounds far more relevant than reopening Hillary to have at least opened an investigation about that. And it seems shocking to me, as does the Obama administration's reaction. Once again, when you talk about foreign policy, the Obama administration does not get 5 stars. And this issue of how they've handled Russia, they did to Russia what Trump did to Mexico. Obama insulted Russia unnecessarily. There was no reason to call it a second-rate regional power, unless what you want to do is just pour gasoline on a fire. There's so much that a president can do by his presentation, by his words, by his conduct to show respect to other nations. And President Obama really dropped the ball with respect to Russia, and to be fair, has dropped the ball in respect to a number of other areas, like Syria, and has left Trump with some real difficulties. And the fact is about Russia, they don't have to be a mortal enemy. There's no reason for it. I think to that extent, Trump is right. Russia has to clean up its act, and at the same time, some form of face saver can be negotiated. The real hard point is, what are we going to do about Crimea? How is Crimea to be resolved? That is one of the key points for European integrity, as well as obviously the expansion that's going on in eastern Ukraine is incredibly threatening. But one believes that can be more controlled. I think from a Putin standpoint, Crimea is probably entering the realm of the non-negotiable. And that presents a real problem because it's around Crimea and eastern Ukraine that the entire sanctions morass is based.
You've talked a lot about what the corporations can do and what the federal government can do. Do you have a charge for the individual? Is there something that you feel like the individual can do?
Yeah, I'll tell you, I think that one of the things the last election demonstrated very significantly is that individuals can do a lot. The last election demonstrated it. The March on Washington the day after the inaugural demonstrated it, even though there were fewer people at the March on Washington than at the inaugural. We all know that. That was very powerful. And I think with the assistance of the internet, with the assistance of media, harnessing technology, a tremendous amount can be done. In fact, arguably, the Trump team did a tremendous amount by harnessing digital technology. And the same team that did Trump did Brexit. And it's led to a lot of very powerful and obviously somewhat difficult outcomes.
Well, thank you very much for speaking with us today. We'll have a link to your blog and site and our video as well for our viewers. And thanks for stopping by.
Thank you.